Hi everyone, I'm Natalia, a member of the media team of Kortrijk 2022, the 97th International Session of the European Youth Parliament. For this podcast, I am joined by Nina.
Hi, my name is Nina, and I'm from the Netherlands, and I will be the chairperson of JURI during Kortrijk 2022.
Nina, can you read for us the topic sentence of your committee, JURI?
Of course. So the topic sentence reads as follows. You're tripping. Following Portugal's complete decriminalization of all drugs with its effects on reducing crime and overdoses, the decriminalization of drugs has become an ongoing debate between oppositional forces. Considering this debate, what stance should the EU take on the legal status of drugs?
Thank you very much. So in order to kick off this podcast, I think it's really important to set out some important terms for our listeners. So could you describe to us what addiction is according to your research so far?
So in our case, addiction is, of course, about drug addiction. So we talk specifically about basically the reliance on drugs and the effects that that can have on someone's life. In this case, of course, there is a very big difference between types of addiction. Most legal definitions of drug use separate drug use basically in two types of drugs. So you have soft drugs and hard drugs. And that means that legally, an addiction to weed is considered very differently from an addiction to hard drugs like heroin, for instance. And of course, this also socially, this has very different meanings. Addiction is almost always both a mental and a physical reliance on a substance. But for instance, if someone is addicted to cannabis, that manifests very differently in their life than when it's to a very harmful drug that can have very harmful physical consequences, like opioids, for instance, or any injectable drug. So yeah, I think that's the main definition that we use. But of course, addiction is very broad and has a lot of very different representations in day-to-day life. Yeah.
That's very interesting, actually, because also through this definition, it's pretty clear to see that addiction is pretty much a health issue, both a mental one, but also a physical one. But oftentimes we see that society faces substance addicted people as criminals. And oftentimes an addiction to any sort of substance is viewed as a criminal activity and not a health issue. So what could you comment about this?
Legally, internationally, it has been decided by the UN that drug production and transport, etc., always has to be in some type of illegal sphere. So this means that most types of drug use are seen as criminal in most countries. And we have seen since the early 2000s that there has been kind of a move towards more decriminalization efforts, for instance, in Portugal, but also in many countries in South America. And on a smaller scale, for instance, in the Netherlands, where weed is decriminalized, and decriminalization efforts strive to think of drug use as a more social issue rather than a criminal issue. But still, with most hard drugs, even when it is decriminalized, like in Portugal, the decriminalization doesn't mean that there are no legal consequences. It's still legal. It's just that it's not really being acted on. But for instance, addicts or people who sell drugs, etc., could still get fines, could still get short sentences even, but just it's a lot more tolerated in society. So we do see this kind of move towards seeing drug use as more of a social or a health issue, but still in large parts of society, it's seen as something completely criminal that needs to have strict legal consequences attached to it.
So while I was reading your topic overview, I came across a very interesting term, which is called harm reduction. And from what I understood, this term refers to measures that basically try to mitigate the effects that drugs have on the people who use them, but not through criminalizing their acts, but for example, through providing them the needed dose for their addiction so that they don't go to drug sources that actually might be dangerous for them and might cause them severe health problems or even be fatal. So, how would you describe this term also according to the example of Portugal so far?
Yeah, I think that's a very good definition of harm reduction. So, harm reduction is basically a policy approach where either organizations or governments decide, okay, drug use exists. This is something that we can't just abolish by, for instance, criminalizing it. And it is an approach that focuses on, like it's in the name, reducing the harm that drugs can bring to society, to individuals, to families, communities, etc. So that can, for instance, be through healthcare services. So, like the provision of clean needles, which has been implemented in many countries, like Portugal as well, where you have needle exchange programs, where if someone like hands in a dirty needle, you get a clean needle back, or efforts like drug injection rooms in Switzerland and France. Basically, any kind of health service that makes drug use safer. But this also includes anything that can kind of minimize addiction. So, for instance, clinics that might help people work around their addiction or become less addicted to something. For instance, anti-opioid therapies and stuff like that, where other drugs are used to minimize the effects of more harmful drugs. It's a very broad term, I think, harm reduction, but it basically includes everything that views drug use as something that is that won't just disappear, that's kind of inherent in society. And so through these approaches, governments and organizations are able to minimize the harmful effects.
Thank you very much for this answer. And I think that now I'm going to go to a different direction in this conversation and mention the European strategy for drug policies. And if I'm not mistaken, this is called the EU Drugs Strategy 2021 to 2025, which means that it has to be implemented through this certain period of time. So does this strategy rather aim to decriminalize drugs in a safe way, where, for example, they would reinforce policies such as the ones that you just mentioned? Or do you think that this strategy rather focuses on further criminalizing drugs, whether it comes to the drug commerce or whether it comes to even the drug use itself?
So the EU Drug Strategy 2021-2025 is a continuation of a line of drug strategies. The previous one was the one implemented from, if I'm correct, 2016 until 2020. It shows basically the very broad European approach to drug use. And the EU stance currently on drug use is very much, okay, we will let the member states decide what they do, but still they're very much into criminalization efforts. So although they do sort of focus on addressing drug-related harm, which is one of the main three goals, it mostly focuses on mitigating drug crime. So the strategy aims to basically eradicate these drug rings, which come from outside of the EU, and it's basically organized crime groups. And they work together with law enforcement like Frontex or Eurojust or other European law enforcement agencies to round up these drug rings. So it's very much focused on a criminal approach to the problem, and it doesn't really offer any clear solutions on, okay, but how are we addressing the current social impact of drug use? And it doesn't really suggest anything to do with decriminalization. Also because of competences, of course, because the EU just does not have the competence to actually legislate on the legal status of drugs in member states. But it also does not suggest any legal approach. It mostly acts on a very broad European level and mostly a criminal one.
That's very interesting, actually, that the EU is not heading towards a way more perhaps inclusive and considerate approach to this issue, given the fact that drug addicted people face a lot of stigma as well. And seeing strategies as this only focus in the criminal aspect of drugs is to me personally kind of disappointing, but I think it also raises a lot of questions. And I think one of the questions that also popped into my head, and I can presume that the same question arises to everyone's heads when we speak about a drug criminalization or decriminalization is oftentimes a comparison between drug substances, either soft drugs or hard drugs, as you mentioned before, with other addictive substances nonetheless, such as tobacco, for example, or alcohol, who have been normalized throughout all these decades, for example, and are legal and are addictive nonetheless, perhaps obviously with different sorts of consequences to the person that is addicted to these specific substances. But what would you say is your opinion regarding this weird dichotomy in a legal aspect? The fact that on the one hand, we legalize tobacco use and we legalize alcohol consumption from a certain age, obviously. And the fact that even soft drugs, such as cannabis, for example, is not legalized in most European countries right now, except if it's for medical uses, for example.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to look at the approach towards tobacco and alcohol, because most arguments for the legalization of tobacco and alcohol is cultural reasons, which of course historically makes a lot of sense because alcohol and tobacco both have very, I think, important cultural and historical connotations. And it's something that's very normal in society. But of course, when we look at the effects, for instance, alcohol poisoning or other like negative effects of these things that are also basically drugs, but then a very different legal approach, it of course comes to mind whether this might not also be possible with other types of substances. But then on the other hand, for instance, cannabis does not have the same cultural aspect tied to it like alcohol does, for instance. So yeah, in most decriminalization efforts or even legalization efforts, we can see kind of a strive towards this type of regulation because, of course, alcohol and tobacco are not drugs that don't have anything tied to them. Like there are very strict regulations. For instance, with cigarettes, the packaging has to have the warnings on them that smoking kills and stuff like that. And in a lot of efforts towards decriminalization, we can see that people who are in support of that also want that kind of regulation surrounding other types of drugs. It would be interesting to see how that could work out. But of course, I want my delegates mostly to decide what they think of this and kind of how they see this difference, because of course there is a difference. You can't really compare, I think, really addictive substances like the heroin to drinking a glass of wine on a Saturday night. But alcohol addiction is a very big problem in society. And I think it's very interesting to see how most governments handle this, even like different approaches in the EU. For instance, in most Nordic countries, you have nationalized alcohol so that you can only buy alcohol with quite high tax rates and that the prices are quite high, which of course also changes consumption rates, stuff like that. And it would be interesting to see how that could work out in attempts with other drugs.
Following up to your answer, which cleared up a lot of second thoughts that one might have had in their heads after reading your topic overview or even engaging with the issue itself, I would like to ask you maybe a bit more in specific, if in your personal opinion and according to your personal research so far, if decriminalizing drugs in the European Union would entail complete and boundless freedom, because I think a lot of the times when we talk about decriminalizing drugs, people think that it's going to be something completely out of hand and not, for example, regulated, such as you mentioned, the alcohol market in Scandinavian countries, for example. And I also think a lot of the times one of the arguments that people bring up against decriminalizing drugs is the fact that what if people start doing drugs now that they're legal for recreational purposes and not because they're actually addicted? Because for example, there's this issue of, okay, so if we legalize, for example, heroin, which is a hard drug and very highly addictive, why can we not also legalize other recreational drugs, such as, for example, different types of mushrooms or other psychedelic drugs that are usually used for recreational purposes and not because someone is specifically addicted to this substance? So what would an argument against this type of thinking would be?
statistically, if we look at the effects of decriminalization, it has the exact opposite effects of what most people think that the effects would be. For instance, in Portugal, the drug deaths suddenly plummeted after decriminalization was implemented. Same with general drug use in Portugal. Drug use in Portugal has been below the European average since the implementation of decriminalization, basically. So I think that is very important to keep in mind. And of course, it's also very important to keep in mind the difference between decriminalization and legalization. One of the main problems of decriminalization is that it is still criminal. It's still illegal. You might not be actually prosecuted, but it's still illegal. Like if police might see you, you have the chance that you will be, I don't know, fined or anything else. So, of course, this makes it more difficult to regulate. And then one of the interesting things of legalization, as we can see also with alcohol and tobacco, is that it is very easy to regulate. For instance, right now there is this cannabis legalization experiment in the Netherlands because only soft drugs are decriminalized here, which means that you can buy it in certain shops, which are called coffee shops. But the production and the transport of weed is still illegal. So how those substances come to be in those coffee shops, that's illegal. But they just tolerate that, basically. And now there's this experiment where they have legalized it, the transport and the production, etc., of weed in a few coffee shops around the Netherlands. And it's still a work in progress, so there are no real results yet. But I think it's very interesting to see how this could impact the current approach and kind of see what the effects could be of this legalized type of production and transport. So I think that's the main difference. So it's important to keep that in mind. But of course, with legalization comes other problems as well. But I do think it's very interesting to see that scientifically and statistically, there are basically no pro-arguments for complete criminalization of drugs, because it ensures that drug crime is more prominent. It ensures that there are more addicts, more overdoses, more harmful use of drugs. So yeah, most of the effects that people think that decriminalization would have, so for instance, increased drug use, that's just not really true if you look at the numbers.
So I'm very glad that you gave this very full answer on this question, which also touches up the next question that I wanted to pose to you. It was regarding two terms that basically you have already explained through your words, but now we can give the official terms to the listeners. It's abolitionism and drug liberalization. So abolitionism, if I'm not mistaken, means to completely criminalize the use and commerce and exporting of drugs, for example, while drug liberalization allows for some space for tolerating its commerce and also providing some ways to provide those addictive substances to drug addicted people so that they don't have to resort to criminal activity, for example. So based on that, what would you say are the specific advantages that a more drug liberal approach would bring, but more specifically when it comes to the health of these people, substance addicted people, but also in general society as a whole, who tends to put way more stigma on the people themselves and not the deeper social issue behind it.
So abolitionism, like you said, is the idea that drug use can be abolished in society if we have the policies to actually do that. And most abolitionists believe that the right course to abolish drug use is through criminalization. And then you have drug liberalization on the other hand, which is all policy approaches. So from depenalization, where people are just not punished, towards complete legalization. So those are all the approaches that have some type of liberal approach to drug use. And like you said, of course, there are different pros and cons towards all these approaches. And what we can see with efforts towards drug liberalization, we can see that this has an effect on the general approach towards addicted people. So when it comes to decriminalization, most of these efforts also include harm reduction, which of course focuses on drug addiction as a social issue and a health issue, which of course impacts the lives of these people. And we can see that in most abolitionist schools of thought, for instance, in Sweden right now, where there are a lot of very restrictive policies, we can see that this has negative effects on the amount of drug use. For instance, in Sweden, I believe that they have twice the European average of drug users, and no, I think even triple the amount of drug users and twice the amount of drug deaths. So that's quite a staggering difference when it comes to a country that usually prides itself on its restrictive policies, also in terms of other like social issues. So I think it's very interesting to kind of compare these different strategies and see what they can do for the people and what kind of legal effects they have, what they ask of governments, what they ask of law enforcement, etc.
Thank you very much for this very extensive answer. And as a final question for this topic, I would like to hear your personal view, but also your view based on your research so far on what the best case scenario could be about this situation, or what the worst case scenario could be, taking into account the EU strategy so far, taking into account the stance that most members of the European Union so far have regarding criminalization or decriminalization of drugs. How do you think next years will look like, and what do you fear and hope for the most?
Yeah, I think the worst case scenario, and in this case, the scenario that is currently happening, is member states as well as the EU not doing anything. I think that is the biggest like general critique that most critics have surrounding this topic, that there is not really a clear stance or a clear approach or anything that is unified in the approach towards drugs and the legal status of drugs. So what I think would be very interesting to discuss as a committee is what we want the best case scenario to be, and to kind of see, okay, what are the delegates' personal opinions? What are the different approaches that we could utilize, and what can the general stance be? And then, do we want a cohesive European approach? Do we want the member states to decide based on their own cultural and historic values of what does research say is the best approach, etc.? And I think in the future, it's very interesting to see the different types of approaches, for instance, what harm reduction could bring to the conversation, so that we do not only talk about legality and what does legality mean, but also a more social approach. Okay, what does this have as an effect on the people who are actually affected by this issue? What do the families and the communities of drug addicted people think? Of course, this is also very much a social issue. Drug addiction is not something that is a standalone issue. It's not just something that appears. It's very much socialized. I study sociology, so I'm very interested in that. For instance, most lower income communities, as well as LGBT people of color, have a higher chance of becoming addicted to drugs. And that's not because those communities like drugs more or something like that, or because they sell them more or anything. That's statistically not true. But it is a very interesting perspective to keep in mind. Like, why do these already marginalized groups also have more issues with drug addiction, for instance? And for instance, why do people of color get arrested more for drug offenses while they do not sell more? For instance, in the UK, there have been some very interesting research done where you can see that white people generally sell drugs more, but I think Black and brown people have like triple the amount of arrest rates, which is quite shocking to see. And of course, does the criminal justice system then reflect these marginalized groups well? Stuff like that. So yeah, I would like to see an approach that kind of keeps all of these separate social issues in mind and then connects it to a legal approach, as we are the Committee on Legal Affairs, and that we can come to a holistic answer that hopefully will be the best case scenario.
Thank you very much for all your interesting and honestly very insightful answers. And thank you for this interview. I hope that the listeners and the watchers of this podcast also found it interesting. Any last words from your side?
For my delegates, do your own research, think about what you find interesting. And for all the other listeners, I hope that you enjoyed this podcast and that it gave you some new insights maybe about the topic, got you thinking a bit about what for effect this has in your life and what you think about it. And I hope that during Kortrijk we can discuss this holistically and come to an interesting conclusion.
Thank you very much, and a very warm goodbye to everyone who listened to this podcast.
Bye.